What's up, everybody? A little bit different of a video today. I'm going to be talking about the book, the Iliad, the classic work by Homer. Now, your experience is probably pretty similar to mine in that Homer's Iliad and perhaps the Odyssey as well were introduced to you when you were young, maybe something like middle school, maybe something like early high school in your lit class or so forth. I distinctly remember learning about the Odyssey and the Iliad with a wonderful English lit professor or teacher that we had back in high school, where she had various of us acting out certain roles to try to keep us involved and so forth. I remember I was Patroclus and my friend was Achilles, another friend was Hector and so forth. It was a wonderful time, but I didn't really care. I didn't really care very much in high school about ancient literature. I certainly wasn't really interested in being a particularly well-read person. And so some of the main storyline kind of passed right over me and right through me. I got enough of it to kind of be vaguely interested in the fight scenes and so forth, but I really wasn't interested in delving into the details. Later on in life, here I am now, a pastor and a professor and so forth, and I really value some of the things that I wish I had studied better back when I was in high school and college. So recently what I did is I've been taking up some of the books that I probably should be understanding a little bit better and reading them as an adult. And the Iliad is one of those books where I just felt that I should probably try again with this one, given that it's a classic in literature and so forth. And because I'm a pastor, I have a particular interest in my people reading well and reading things that are good and edifying. So in this short video, what I'd like to do is talk about whether or not Christians should read something like Homer's Iliad. And honestly, here I could give a bit of a warning for you that there are definitely some mature themes in the book, and so I wouldn't just throw it into the hands of every Christian person. I'm not sure where you are in your walk in sanctification, how much tolerance you have for violence and sexuality and so forth. So I'll give a couple of cautions about this towards the end of this particular video. But for the most part, what I want to do in today's video is argue that Christians probably should read things like Homer's Iliad, and to do that, I'm going to give you 4 or 5 reasons why that's probably true. So what's up, everybody? If you're new to this channel, my name is Matthew. I'm the pastor of Gospel Fellowship PCA. We are a Reformed Bible-believing church just north of Pittsburgh. If you're looking for a church like that, please come check us out. Also an adjunct professor at RPTS, the Reformed Presbyterian Theological Seminary in Pittsburgh. So that being said, let's talk about why you should read the Iliad. And the first thing I want to mention to you is that to do so will help you to be a well-read person. Now, this is actually the first and highest reason why I threw myself into reading this book over the summer, because I want to be a well-read person. I want to be broadly educated. I want to have what they used to call in the old days a liberal education. And by that, I don't mean liberal versus conservative. I'm certainly not a progressive. I'm the furthest thing from that. I'm very conservative in my worldview. But they used to speak of a liberal education as being one in which you were well-rounded in all things. You had solid math and geometry and sciences and literature, and you had something of the social sciences and history and all that. And I want to be that. Now, my profession is very narrowly focused on pastoral ministry, theology, preaching, teaching, doing the things that pastors do. But I want to be considered a well-read person. And books like Homer's Iliad are just some of those classic works in which there are cultural references to these things practically all the time. And if you're not aware of them, you're not even aware of how much you miss. There are certain things that probably every person should know and read in their lifetimes, and the Iliad is certainly one of those books. It's almost like Moby Dick, the classic literary masterpiece of American literature. I threw myself into this book a couple of years ago now, hadn't read it, didn't know about it, but it'd be embarrassing, wouldn't it, if you didn't know whether Moby Dick is the whale or the sailor that's hunting him. If you knew nothing about Moby Dick, you probably have a little bit of homework to do. And the same thing is true with so many others of the classic pieces of literature. People should probably read Frankenstein. They should probably read books like The Great Gatsby. There's so many of these classic literary masterpieces that we ought to know. Now, the Iliad, of course, is not English literature. It wasn't written in English at all. It's one of the great ancient masterpieces. But nevertheless, the plot lines and the themes are so prevalent in movies and various tropes in our conversation and whatnot that you should probably read the Iliad just so that you're a well-read person. But there's another reason that I think that that's true, and that's also simply because it has an incredible plot line. It's an incredible story. So let me share with you in just 60 seconds or so what the story is about. Okay, so the Greeks are at war with the Trojans. Why are the Greeks and the Trojans fighting each other? Well, Paris, who is a Trojan, he stole the wife of one of the Greeks, the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen, and he takes her to himself, takes her back to Troy. Well, of course, the Greeks are going to be furious about that, and so Agamemnon, one of the Greek kings, he brings all of his army across the sea to Troy to try to take Helen back. Now, in so doing, there's tension being built between the two great warriors. The greatest Greek warrior is Achilles, and the greatest Trojan warrior is, of course, Hector. And at first, the Trojans are just slaughtering the Greeks who've come to their shores, and Hector is winning victory after victory. Achilles is ticked off. He doesn't want to fight. He's mad at Agamemnon over a certain girl that he liked, Briseis. But as the story builds and Hector's victories mount, Achilles is more and more drawn into the battle until finally you have this denouement moments where Hector and Achilles are going to fight. And this is one of the great fight scenes in literature. And if you haven't read it, should I tell you who wins? Maybe I won't. But the story itself is a great classic story. And of course, meanwhile, you have this sort of two-tiered plot line, whereas the human beings are doing battle on Earth. Also, the gods, the plurality of the Greek polytheistic pantheon, they're also warring against each other. They get involved too. So the story is very interesting and people will love it. There's romance, there's of course war, there's battle, there's some gratuitous violence and so forth. But the story itself is incredibly interesting. But more than that, one of the reasons why I think Christians should have some familiarity with the story is that much of what's discussed is relevant. I can't say it's crucial to, but it is relevant to our own New Testament background. So let's have a look at a map here, and you're going to see immediately how this relevance comes into play in the New Testament, and then I'm going to give you at least one example where the story of the Iliad is relevant in our New Testament. So first of all, here we've got what is called Greece, or it's called Achaia here in the New Testament maps. This is your map from the back of your Bible. They're called the Achaeans rather than the Greeks quite a bit in the Iliad. But look over here, just across the way is Troas, as it's called in the New Testament, or Troy, as it's called in the Iliad. These two places are not too far off. And what's interesting is that this is exactly where Paul in the New Testament is doing his missionary journeys. So as you probably know, in Paul's first missionary journey, he comes up here through Galatia and he begins to plant a few churches. But then in his second and third missionary journeys, he goes even further and he's going to go, and Paul is going to visit all of these places that are relevant in the Iliad. So he's at Assos, he's at Troas, he's going to cross the sea over to Philippi and down to Berea, Thessalonica. He's going to go to Corinth, he's going to go to Athens and so forth. And so all of the places that are mentioned in the Iliad are also relevant to the New Testament, as these are the very places that Paul goes on his missionary journeys. So as you're learning about the background of Greek history here, you're also learning something of the very rudimentary background context of the New Testament, as Paul in his travels is directly right upon, juxtaposed to, layered upon the very places that the story is happening in the Iliad. So there's a lot of sort of cross-fertilization of information, we might say, between the Iliad and the New Testament. Now, let me just give you one example of why this background might be helpful. So here we have the city of Ephesus, which is pretty close to Troy. You can see that on the map here. Certainly these cities here in Asia Minor would feel some kinship and interrelationship to each other in the same way that these city-states over here, Corinth and Athens and the other Greek cities, they would have kinship to one another there. Well, remember that when Paul goes to Ephesus, there's a riot in Acts chapter 21. Let me just look this up real quick in my Bible. Pretty sure that's right. Could be mistaken. Actually, no, it takes place in chapter 19. There's a riot in Ephesus. Now, why is there a riot? Well, because the Ephesians are disturbed that Paul's gospel preaching is upsetting their idol business, especially their temple to and dedication to Artemis, who's one of the key gods in Ephesus. Well, why are the Ephesians so loyal to Artemis? Okay, well, this actually is relevant to the plot because certain of the gods in the story of the Iliad take sides with Achaia, and certain others of them take sides with the Trojans. And Artemis and her brother Apollo are two of those gods which end up defending the Trojans. So inasmuch as there's a close proximity between Ephesus and Troas, we can see here that, of course, this side, the Asia Minor side, is going to be devoted to Artemis because she was devoted to them during the Trojan War. And so that's just a little bit of background. But there are other things too, as we learn about the cities, their relevance, their heroes, their gods, and so forth. Some of this is just helpful background as we're studying our New Testament, and I think you'll probably find at least some interesting things there. But next, and this is probably the most important reason why I would say that it's interesting to read at least the Iliad, perhaps the Odyssey too, is that the glory of the gospel just shines forth as so much better than the gods of the Greeks and the Romans. And this is obvious. Now, one of the things that becomes interesting as Paul is going around on his missionary journeys in the book of Acts, starting in chapter 13 and carrying on to chapter 21 and 22, is that Paul is experiencing that the Greeks are coming to faith in Christ in much greater numbers than the Jews, which is sort of, contrary-wise to what we might expect, because you'd think that the Jews would be the ones that would come to the Messiah. After all, Christ is prophesied in the Jewish Old Testament and the prophecies of Messiah. But as Paul goes out to the synagogues, the Jews are rejecting his message, but the Greeks are turning to Christ in great numbers. Why is that? Well, one of the reasons is because when we look at the story of the Iliad, we realize what kinds of gods they had. The gods of the Greeks and the Romans, they were jealous, they were angry, they were selfish, they were sexually immoral, not only with the other gods, but sometimes even with human beings. They're impetuous, they're impatient, they're very petty. And so what happens is as Paul goes out and he preaches the gospel to all of these cities, and again, just think of those cities on the map that we named: Ephesus, Corinth, Thessalonica, Berea, all these cities that are named in the New Testament. What they realize is that the God of the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ is a much better, purer, holier God than the gods that they had been worshiping. And so as we think even about the fact that the Greeks came to Christ in amazing numbers, well, why did they do that? Because Paul was offering them a gospel that was so much better than the petty, violent, selfish activities of the gods that the Greeks and the Romans believed in. In other words, there's something dynamically better and more beautiful and more wonderful about the God of the New Testament, the God of the Bible, than certainly the gods that the Greeks and the Romans worshipped. Because in Paul's gospel that he's preaching, here is a God who loves the world so much that he actually gives his own son for the sake of our sin to redeem us so that we might come to him in grace and mercy and peace and find joy in our hearts. There's nothing even remotely like that in the gods of the Greeks and the Romans. And reading a story like the Iliad will drive that point home, that Christianity is different, qualitatively, markedly different, and better than the kinds of petty, impetuous, warlike, selfish activities of the gods and the Greeks and the Romans. That's why Christianity flourished in the early days of the first century. Okay, now finally, I will give some cautions again to Christians here. I don't want Christians to rush into reading the Iliad and then be surprised at the violence of the scenes and some of the obvious sexuality in the book. Now, when I say sexuality, there's not like hot and heavy sex scenes or something like that, like some kind of a trashy romance model. No, it's definitely not like that, but it's certainly implied. There are a lot of things that are implied in the book. Some of them just stated very baldly. It's just there. The illicit relationships, adultery, fornication. There's what seems to be sex slavery and so forth as these guys conquer the other armies and take their women. So there's definitely some mature themes that not every Christian should probably be reading. But the violence in the book is definitely gratuitous. There are certainly scenes where the killing of another soldier is described very graphically, with like swords slicing through throats and spears wrangling through eyeballs and that kind of thing. So, of course, I want to offer some pastoral counsel here that you should probably be somewhat careful with who reads this book and when and what stage of life and what your own particular predilections and temptations are. Okay. Overall, though, what I would say is that probably Christians should be familiar with the story of the Iliad and probably the Odyssey as well. Again, it's just something about being a well-read person. These kinds of great books that most people should probably know something about. Okay, well, that's it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to post a recommendation in the link section, the description section of this video, for a good edition of the Iliad, the one that I read, if I can find it. Hopefully I'll post that up there, and you can go grab that. If not, no big deal. Go grab a different edition. There's plenty of editions out there. It's been around for hundreds and thousands of years, so I'm sure you can find a good edition on your own. That's all I have for you today. Thanks for checking in. Love you lots. Talk to you later.